All right, folks, so today we're going to do a little bit of bow building Q&A. Now, I've got a list of questions here that were submitted on my Patreon site, and so we're just going to go ahead and dive right into it. So I've got a question here from Scott Santor, who's asking, when is the best time to remove propeller twist from a stave? Now, I just want to give you just a little bit of background. If you're new to bow building, you might not know what propeller twist is. And so basically, when you cut a tree, oftentimes that tree, as it grows, the grain will spiral a little bit around that tree. Ideally, you don't want a lot of spiral. Ideally, you don't want any at all, but oftentimes you will have a little bit. And that grain spiral will show up in a bow as having one limb pointed one way and one pointed the other way. And it looks like a propeller. And so that is propeller twist. So Scott, I like to get my bows at least part of the way through the floor tailoring process before I do any heat bending at all, whether it's doing recurves, removing propeller twist, straightening out a crooked stave or anything like that. And the reason I like to get it part of the way through the floor tailoring process is because that allows me to reduce the thickness and reduce the mass of the wood that I'm trying to heat. Because the less wood that you have to bend, the less heat it's going to require and the much easier it's going to bend. All right, so Scott also asks about, he says he's building a short osage recurve and the bow is starting to take a little bit of set during the tillering process. Now, the bow that he's working on is 60 inches. It is a recurve, so when you recurve a bow, you effectively reduce the working part of the limb. And so all of that stress that's distributed over that bow limb, you're kind of squashing that into a smaller area. So it tends to be a little bit higher stressed design than just a straight limbed longbow. But there's a lot of reasons that a bow could take set or string follow during that tillering process. One of them might be that you're exceeding your target weight. So if you're aiming for a 50-pound bow, you don't, at any one time during the tillering process, you don't really want to exceed that by very much. So for example, if you're shooting for a 50-pound bow, you don't want to put 70 pounds of pressure on it because in essence, you're just stressing that belly wood and compressing that belly wood more than it needs to be. And that oftentimes will result in set or string follow. Now, when I'm building a bow, sometimes it's just inherent in the wood. Different staves just behave differently. But when I'm building a bow, if I see early in the tillering process that a bow is starting to take set, and I'm talking about early, like before I have a string on it. If it looks like a stave is going to start to take some set early in the process, I'll go ahead and heat treat the belly of that bow. And what that's going to do is temper the belly of that bow and harden those belly cells, making them more resistant to compression and more resistant to set. So that might be something to look into. All right, moving on down the list, I've got a question here from Wesley, and I hope I say this right, Wesley Tile. But he is wondering if it's possible to make a 64-inch bow with a 32-inch draw. And Wesley, absolutely, it is possible to do that. I keep getting text messages here. In my book, I think I recommend something like a draw length to overall bow length. Good grief. Oh, this reminds me, this is Matt Zernzak and Tim Nebel with the Push Archery. This doesn't have anything to do with bow building, but I am working on something with those guys, so stay tuned. If you haven't checked out their stuff on the pusharchery.com, they've got a really good podcast and they've got some really good videos explaining different shooting methods and all that stuff. So if you haven't checked those guys out, you might head over there and check that out, especially if you want to improve your shooting. I'm going to turn those guys off. I think I recommend a draw length to overall bow length ratio of something like 2.24. And so basically you would take your draw length, multiply that by 2.24, and that's going to give you a pretty safe design for a bow. Now that ratio, what you would get from that, that's going to be a very, very long bow. But it's also going to be a very safe bow. And so when you start really squishing that bow length down and trying to get as much draw length out of those bows as you can certainly do it, but you're edging towards the limits on what that wood will handle. And so you have very little margin for error in those highly stressed bows. Your tiller has to be absolutely perfect, or you're going to develop a hinge, or the bow's just going to break. Now, once you get some experience under your belt and you start figuring out the little nuances of tiller and getting every bit of those limbs to doing their fair share of work, then you can start thinking about really reducing that overall bow length, or the knock-to-knock length, in relation to your draw length. Here recently, I posted some pictures on Instagram of a bow that I'd made that was, I want to say 56 inches knock to knock, and I was drawing at 28, it was 50 pounds or 52 pounds at 28 inches. And that was a Selfbow, no backing or anything, and that was a full-on static recurve. And so when you start pushing bows to that extreme, you're really, really pushing the limits of what that wood can handle. And I would say that not all staves, like I said before, not all staves are created equal. You might find one stave that will handle that design very well, and another stave that just won't handle it. All right, got a question here from Jonathan Turner. He is working on a board bow, and it's already developed a hinge. Now, I would assume that since he's already got this bow on the tillering rack and he's drawing on it, he's already got this bow backed with something, rawhide probably. And he's just wondering if there's any way that he can fix this. Can he heat it up and like unbend that area or unhinge that area, or can he temper that area in some way? I would say that probably the best thing to do here is just chalk that up as a learning experience. During the tillering process, I had said before that you don't ever want to exceed your target draw weight, but you don't want to go to your target draw weight if you already see a problem occurring. And so, for example, if you have a bow up on your tillering rack and you draw it, you might only be hitting 30 pounds, but if and your target weight might be 50, but if you can see a problem at 30 pounds, don't go to 50, because you're going to take that problem that you see and make it a whole lot worse. And so if you draw it down maybe 6 inches or so, and you might only be hitting 30 pounds, and you see a hinge starting, stop and fix the problem before you draw it any farther. So you're going to have to take the rest of the bow down to match that hinge that's developing. Got a couple of questions here from Eric Givens. What material do you guys use on your arrow shelf and strike plate? Eric, I have used all sorts of different stuff. I've used beaver hide and just trimmed that fur down low. I've used buckskin. And the stuff that I've been using lately is just plain old Velcro with a sticky side on it. You can get this stuff from any craft store. Just trim it to the area that you want, peel it, stick it on there. And the good thing about Velcro, first of all, it looks pretty good. It's very quiet. It's durable, and it is weather resistant. So you can get this stuff rained on, doesn't matter. You go with something like buckskin or a leather or something like that, that's gonna soak up water and potentially change how your arrows shoot off your bow. All right, next question from Eric. At what point should I recurve my bow? That's a very good question. He says that he has a bow that he's floor tillering and it's bending nicely, and he's just wondering if he should just go ahead and recurve it then. And I would say that absolutely, that is the exact point that you want, or for me personally, that's when I recurve the bows. Like I was talking about prop twist earlier, I want to get those limbs thinned down and bending before I do any kind of heat bending. And so oftentimes I'll actually put it up on the tillering rack and start really drawing it down. I won't get it all the way to full draw, but I'll get it bending pretty well before I go and recurve those things. Because again, the thinner you have that wood, the much easier it's gonna bend. But at the same time, you still need an adequate thickness to hold that recurve once the bow is done. When you're finishing your tiller on those bows, on those recurve bows, you just want to pull those scrapes off before you really get down into the recurve so that you don't end up reducing that thickness so much that your recurves pull out. All right, I got a question here from Ryan Doomville, and I hope I said that right. But he asked just what's the best way to store sinew for long periods of time. And so what I do, I've got a video showing how to process backstrap, like elk backstraps. And in that video, I show how I remove the sinew from a backstrap. And it's basically you put it sinew side down on a big flat board, and you take a fillet knife and you fillet that sinew off just like you would fillet a big fish. Once you have it on that board, you just take a spoon and scrape all of that excess meat and stuff off, and then all you've got to do is set that thing out in the sun, and it'll be dry in half an hour. Once it's dry, you can store that stuff indefinitely. I've had sinew sitting around in my shop that's been there that I've probably had for 15 years, and it's just as good today as it was the day I took it off the animal. All right, so Sam Tents asks, when you're working with osage, do you heat treat the belly like you do when you're working with some of the whitewoods? Sam, I sometimes heat treat the belly on my osage bow, especially like I was talking about earlier, when I start to see set. If I see set developing early in the tillering process, that's an indication to me that I need to do something because that set's only going to get worse the farther or the more I stress that wood. And so at that time, if I see any set starting to develop, I'll go ahead and heat treat those bellies. Another good time to heat treat the belly on an osage bow is if you want to put that thing on a form, on a back set form or something like that. Heat treating those bellies is a really good way to maintain a lot of that back set, and it really just, it hardens those belly cells and belly fibers and makes it much less susceptible to taking string follow or set. But with that said, with osage, most of the time, it's not really necessary. Now with a lot of the whitewoods like hickory, I would recommend probably heat treating every hickory bow that you make because hickory does have a tendency to follow the string a little bit if you don't. There's some other things that come into play with hickory there, but again, I cover that on the hickory section of on the Patreon site. So, all right, so Matt Walker asks, do you have a video showing the handle layout and arrow shelf and fades and how all that stuff works together? Matt, I have not covered that yet. I think I did a very short little Facebook video a couple of years ago about it, showing my arrow shelf and how that relates to the fades and all of that stuff. But that is something that's going to be coming to Patreon here very, very soon. So watch out for that. So there's one other question that I get like all the time, and it's a variation of the same question, and I haven't decided how best to answer this yet. And it goes something along the lines of like, what's the minimum bow weight for hunting deer or elk or elephant? Or can I hunt elk with a 50-pound bow or something like that? I'm not gonna tackle that question in this video. I'm gonna do a whole nother video and focus solely on that because it is not an easy question to answer. There's a lot of things that come into play when you talk about like penetration. I mean, it's not just draw weight, it's arrow weight, it's broadhead design, it's draw length, it's arrow tuning, it's a lot of different stuff. And so, but it is something, especially this time of year leading up to hunting season, this is a question I get probably 2 or 3 times a week from different guys. So that is something that I'm gonna address in the future, just not here. So until I can make a video to address that question specifically, there's some great resources online. If you're interested in arrow penetration, I would highly, highly recommend that you go and check out the Ashby studies, and you can find that. I'll actually put a link to that in the video description. If you go to tradbow.com, they've got a whole section on there, and they've actually got a forum that's dedicated to FOC and penetration and the Ashby studies and all that stuff. So that's a really good resource. That's all the questions that I have, but I did want to mention one thing. Now on the Patreon site, I've got a 3-part series on how to make these takedowns, but I wanted to mention one thing about these things. Quite often when you're shooting these things, the handle here will very slightly break loose from the top piece. Now, when it does that, it can make some noise when you're shooting it, and it's like a creaking noise. Now, that can be very annoying, and it can be troublesome if you're trying to hunt with these bows. And so the way that you fix that is just take some very thin super glue, and anywhere you see a crack around this part right here, string the bow and start filling that thing in, and leave it strung until that super glue sets. The reason that you want it strung is because you want that thing stressed open. Any cracks, you want them to be stressed open, and fill those up with super glue. Now the next thing you can do is down inside this handle, you'll see where, like this part where your handle wrap kind of meets the wood. Anywhere that you see a crack in there, again, fill that in with super glue. Now be careful when you're doing that, because you don't want to get a bunch of super glue all in here, because your tenon isn't going to fit in here very well if you do that. But if you just pay attention and get your super glue just in that boundary between the handle and the wood, you can fill that stuff in. Wait till your super glue dries before you put this thing together. You'll glue it together. But when the super glue dries, it should take care of that noise. So guys, with that, if you guys have any questions, especially if you're signed up for Patreon, go ahead and just submit them to me, and I'll try to do some more videos like this where we just go through there and pick out a few things and address them. And if you have asked a question and I didn't get to it on this, if I have not responded to your question, shoot me an email or a message or something like that, because sometimes things just fall through the cracks. But guys, if you're signed up for Patreon, I really, really appreciate it. You are the guys that are making all the stuff that I do possible, all the hunting videos, all the bow building stuff. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.